Wisey's Game, a short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. It is important that when you call, you are first completely sure to whom it is you are calling. I think I can honestly say that up until the point that it closed temporarily during the global pandemic, I'd had visited the Anchor pub for at least a single pint, virtually every night for the past 45 years. There were, of course, exceptions. In 1992, I had a smash in my car and had to spend a night in the hospital, and midway through 1986, I got married and spent my wedding day and night away from the place. I didn't visit the Anchor on either of those days, though in the case of my wedding night, half the people who would otherwise have been in the pub joined me at my reception venue, so it was pretty much the same thing anyway. The story that follows concerns an event that occurred on just one of the thousands of nights I spent at the Anchor. It happened in the very first of those 45 years, and, in all honesty, the more terrifying moments probably lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet it is a 2 minutes I have thought about every day of the 4.5 decades since. I think that perhaps it's time I committed my version of what happened to paper. First, though, it is important to set the scene. It is hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it just how warm, welcoming, and vitally communal a good old-fashioned British pub can be. There is, in the best of these places, an atmosphere of open-hearted bonhomie and companionship that is difficult to find in any other setting in this day and age. Back in their heyday, the pubs of England were essentially extensions of one's living room. Collective spaces where distinct groups seated around their own tables also operated as a single unit, interacting with those in their own little assembly, but also in the larger community of the space. In a way, the pub was like a microcosm of a society. Each table was like an individual family or home that was at once a nuclear unit of its own, but also one element in a wider community. They were, in a word, homely. This welcoming and domestic aspect of pub culture is felt particularly strongly in the pubs you can refer to as your local. Contrary to popular belief, for a pub to be your local, it does not necessarily mean that it is the closest one to your home. I have known many men in my time who would happily stroll past 6 less welcoming boozers in order to get to that particular safe haven that they recognized as their local. What makes a pub local? Well, that's not an easy thing to define, but basically it is a place where you will find yourself amongst familiar faces and where your own face is considered familiar. It is a place where people enjoying a drink on the other side of the pub might shout over to ask after your mother or son, to check how that thing you are setting up with your missus is going, or whether Dan Peckham returned the hat you left there the week before as they asked him to. It's a place where every conversation is understood to have porous walls, so that any time a person at the next table or even 2 away who happened to overhear can interject to question or add to a point being made, often leading to the conversation spreading and sprawling like some great growing weed, so that it is at once being conducted between small pockets of 2 or 3 participants and also being chewed over by most of the pub at the same time. It was a place where, if you found yourself a few pence short for a pint at last orders, you'd be trusted to return with the remainder the following night. If you paid for them at all, that is, for often the drinks were delivered on the promise of pay tomorrow, the tab literally chalked up on a slate that hung behind the bar. This system, in which the amount of money owed on tick could be easily added to or erased by a dishonest patron or customer and was always trusted and never exploited, speaks to the character of these places. People were kept honest by the fact that everybody knew everybody, meaning they knew who could handle their liquor and who couldn't be trusted to keep an accurate count. A good local, if you could find one, was a home away from home, a small slice of heaven on earth, except on the very rare occasions when it was the exact opposite of a heaven. This story concerns a time that fits into the latter category. The Anchor pub has been my local for almost 45 years. In my student days, I would work weekends and several nights a week behind the bar, pulling pints and making sure that the slate was kept up to date. In later years, it was the place I frequented with my friends and colleagues for drinks in the evening or after work. It was during that first year as a student, back when I was both skinny and skint, that the events I want to relate took place. I had been working behind the bar for about 6 months, and at that point had already been firmly accepted by the regulars as part of the furniture. Though, of course, that process worked both ways, and a good deal of what I learned about the job in those 6 months had nothing to do with pulling pints. As Fred the landlord told me on the very first day, 2/3 of the job was about customer relations, how you relate to them and how they relate to you. What this meant in practice was getting to grips with who was who, knowing what each character's story was, what kind of person they were, and what their particular quirks and idiosyncrasies were. That, as Fred said, was the largest part of the job. It was also what made it so interesting. One of the most fascinating characters in The Anchor, and the one who is key to this particular story, was a guy named John Wiseman, or as everybody in the pub and the surrounding village knew him, Wisey. Wisey was already an old man by the time I met him. He was a wiry, small-made gent, with a shock of the purest snow-white hair on his head. His face was thin and angular, but he smiled often, and, despite his age, had an almost perfect set of teeth. He also had a way of looking at you with his sparkling blue eyes that made you feel as if he was always about to crack a joke, or that there was some kind of mischief about to take place. I think it's fairly safe to say that if you lived in our village around that time, then you would know who Wisey was. It's also fair to say that if you visited the Anchor on a regular basis, you would know about Wisey's game. I suppose when you look at it now, it does have a bit of a witchcraft feel to it, but the way it was presented to us, and the way people used to laugh along with it, never felt that way. Certainly, Wisey was the farthest thing in the world from a witch or sorcerer. He was far more likely to be watching boxing than reading some ancient grimoire, and spent more time with the bookies betting on horses than he ever did casting spells. Still, he did have his little box, and he did play his little game, so I guess you can make of it what you will. The box was given to Wisey during the war, the Second World War, I mean, by a man named Captain Arnold David, whose name Wisey himself used to laugh at. "Bleeding daft, innit, having 2 first names?" According to Wisey, Captain David was his superior in the armed forces. He had fought in the trenches during the First World War and had a wooden leg, which he had received as a result of injuries incurred during the fighting. Somehow, however, this disability did not stop him from continuing his career in the military, nor from going on to serve as a commanding officer in the Second War. In Wisey's version of the story, which he told perhaps once a year to those who hadn't heard it and those interested in hearing it again, Captain David and the young Private Wiseman became quite close in the early years of the war. Despite this, John was still somewhat surprised when his superior called him to his quarters one morning and presented him with a small wooden box, saying that he wished for Wisey to have it. I asked a question this morning, Private, that didn't give me the answer I was expecting. It was not an answer that I liked. As such, I would like to leave this object in your care. Should I return without incident from today's operation, then I will retrieve it from you, and we shall not mention the matter again. If, however, for whatever reason I am unable to join you after today, I would like you to open it. You may use the contents as much as you like, provided that you follow the instructions precisely as they are laid out inside. Do that, and I will do my very best to help you in any way that I can. A word of warning, however. You must, and I can't emphasize this enough, you must follow the instructions as I have set them out. It is important that when you call, you are first completely sure to whom it is you are calling. With that, the captain shook Wisey's hand firmly and headed out on what was to be his final maneuver. He was killed in action later that night. To hear Wisey tell it, The news of his captain's demise was upsetting, but somehow not really a shock.
"Somehow,"
he would say,
I knew because he did, that he wasn't going to be coming back. When he shook my hand that day, I swear to God his hand was already cold. Hard, as if it was made of marble or something. He looked at me that last time, and I don't know how, but I knew that I wouldn't be seeing him again. He knew it too. That's why he prepared."
According to Wisey, the captain had no living relatives to whom he wished to send news or leave any personal items. Why he had chosen to pass what he considered precious on to John Wiseman is a mystery. Though, perhaps less of a mystery, is how he knew to pass it on when he did. Inside the small wooden box which lived either on Wisey's person or on a special shelf behind the bar at the Anchor was a small, folded piece of waxed paper. There was a small wooden spinning top around 2 inches in length, and a short note from the captain himself. On the waxed paper was a carefully drawn design, a 5-pointed star, or pentagram, if you will. In the accompanying letter, the captain explained precisely how to use this star along with the spinning top, in a process of what essentially amounted to some kind of divination or necromancy. Now, in the years since this incident, I have read a lot about 5-pointed stars. I've read how they were adopted by Hollywood to be the universal symbol of anything devilish or witchy, and how during the satanic panic in the United States, some of the more excitable religious types would get into a real lather about anything that might have that particular symbol on it. Apparently, there was even an attempt to prevent children and teenagers from displaying the symbol in any way in public schools. Fortunately, I also read how this supposedly evil symbol had been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years, for its protective and supposedly magical qualities. I read how in Sumer it was used as a symbol of Ishtar and Marduk, how its geometric construction reflects elements of the golden ratio, and how, somewhat ironically, it was for a long time used by Christians themselves, with the 5 points being used to represent the wounds of Christ, the 5 senses, or joys of the Virgin Mary. Wisey neither knew nor cared about any of that stuff, but he did know how to play the game, and also how not to. The playing of Wisey's game became quite a spectacle in the Anchor. At some point during the week, usually during a quiet moment or a lull in conversation, and often on quiz night when the pub would be full, Wisey would suddenly raise his voice and, apropos of nothing, announce that it was time.
All right,
he'd shout, as if in response to some unseen person who had been pestering him.
If you're all going to keep mithering me about it, I suppose it's time to play the game.
He would then reach into his pocket and produce the box. Laying it carefully on the table before him, he would take out and unfold the waxed paper with the star on it, and lie it flat in front of him. He would then ask the rest of the patrons which sporting event for that week they should ask about. This would then cause a clambering overlap of shouts and calls, as hopeful punters tried to get Wisey to ask on their behalf. He would then jokingly refuse, holding up his open palms as if to say, "Enough," or "I couldn't possibly." Then, with rehearsed melodrama, he'd reach into his top shirt pocket and, from it, produce a small slip of paper, neatly folded in the middle. After holding it up for all to see and examine, he would place it carefully into the wooden box as if he expected it to disappear and he was performing some elaborate magic trick, which, in a way, I suppose he was. He would then take the small wooden spinning top, which, if you have never seen one, it is a little like a dreidel. The one that Wisey used was of a polished mahogany colour. At the top and bottom it had a single wooden teat on which he would balance the thing. The middle, squat and fat, looked like a small brown marble someone had squished so that the middle became wider than the top and bottom. Placing the little spinning top onto the piece of waxed paper, he would carefully ensure that it was in the very centre of the 5-pointed star, which he would place carefully so that 2 points were facing toward him and the single point facing away from him. On each of the 2 points that jutted out horizontally, he would place a coin. On the left point, the coin had to be facing heads up, and on the right point, tails up. He would then proceed to spin the tiny top and allow it to wheel around the table's surface, noting with some amusement how it never fell from the table, but would simply dance around drunkenly within the parameters of the star and remain fixedly on the paper itself. When it finally lost momentum and came to rest on its side, he would observe which of the star's 5 points the bottom teat or pointer of the spinning top was facing towards. He would then announce to the room whether the answer was yes or no. In some ways it was similar to the game of Spin the Bottle that frisky and nervous teenagers would play to get a kiss from another in their peer group. The idea behind this ritual was that Wisey was consulting the captain for an answer to whatever question he wanted to ask. The question had been written onto the slip of paper and would never be seen by anyone else before it was placed into the box. Usually, the question was about some sporting event, like boxing, football, or horse racing. The answers were limited to yes and no. The bottom 2 points of the star indicated each respectively. They were not labelled, but after a few spins it was obvious that yes was on the right and no on the left. Whichever answer the spinning top gave was the answer that Wisey would then take with him to the bookmakers in order to place his bets. He would hand the box to Fred the landlord, who would place it behind the bar until the next day, ostensibly so that nobody could interfere with it. The following day, Wisey would come into the Anchor boasting of his winnings, and when the box was opened, it would reveal that what had been asked fit perfectly with the answer. Wisey never gave away before time what the question was, but often people would be able to guess and would bet their own stakes based upon the answer. For example, if he asked, "Will boxer A win?" and the answer was yes, then you could bet with absolute certainty that this would be the case. But if he asked, "Will boxer A lose?" and the answer was yes, then you would have placed a losing bet. On that particular occasion, the answer came out as yes. Most people in the pub assumed that Wisey had asked whether the boxer everyone was rooting for, a local lad who was fighting for the title, would win. When the answer came back as yes, people actually cheered, even though Wisey never gave away what the question was. The following night, we had the fight on the radio in the pub. When our local hero did in fact win, the celebration was incredible, not only because the patrons were happy for him, but because most of the pub, on the strength of Wisey's game, had placed large bets that he would. It was very busy behind the bar that night as people spent up the winnings that hadn't even been collected yet, and Fred gave the nod for us to have a lock-in, pulling back the heavy curtains so the police would not see the lights on and us continuing to serve long after licensing hours had expired. Sure enough, in the midst of this jubilation, when Wisey retrieved his box from behind the bar and opened it, there was the question for all to see. Of course, some people were skeptical. They believed that Fred would change the question each day and place it in the box to make it look like Wisey was always right, a bit of pub theatre, and an in-joke that the two of them shared. The problem with that theory was that the questions were invariably always handwritten, and in Wisey's handwriting. Some, of course, had an answer for this, claiming that Wisey placed 2 questions in the box at a time, and that Fred's job was just to remove whichever question didn't get the right answer each morning before opening. Others questioned why, if Wisey was so sure that the answers would be correct, he was not a far wealthier man. If he knew for sure that he was onto a winner, why not bet the house on it and strike rich over and over? The simple answer to that, according to Wisey himself, was that he had more than enough of what he wanted in the world already. He wasn't greedy, and as long as he had enough to cover his drinks and a few for his friends in the Anchor every night, he would be happy.
"Perhaps,"
he used to say,
"that's why the captain chose me. He knew he could help after he died, but that I'd only take what I needed. I wouldn't go mad with it."
There were exceptions to this, though. One year, during the big storms, part of the roof of the Anchor collapsed. The tiles and beams became partially unstuck in the gale and repairs were needed urgently. A few days later, Wisey walked into the pub with an envelope, handed it to Fred, and told him to get the roof fixed. When Fred said he wouldn't accept a donation like that, Wisey just smiled.
"It's not my money, lad. I just put a bigger bet on yesterday. It's the bookies' money. I had to go to one in the next town because my fellow wouldn't put that big a bet on because he knows I always win."
With that, he took his usual spot at the table in the corner and waited for me to pour his usual order. Now, all of this, of course, sounds pleasant enough, and some of you might be wondering where the sinister element comes into this tale. The answer lies in the way that the game is played. What a lot of people failed to notice, but which Wisey explained to me in detail one night, was that when he placed the star on the table, he did so in a very specific way.
"This way up," he said, "with the 1 point facing up and the 2 on the other end facing down, is the way it has to be done. According to the captain, the other 4 points are all things to do with earth, like dirt, air, water, fire, and the 1 pointing upward is the mind or the spirit or whatever."
The idea, he said, is just that
the spirit, or the soul, or whatever he called it, is above the stuff that you can touch and feel. You know, like heaven being above earth or something like that. Anyway, you have to have the spirit above the matter. If you ever ask, you have to have that point facing upwards. When you call, you have to be sure who you are calling.
Hearing this, I was of course eager to ask who exactly it was that he was calling. To my surprise, Wisey shrugged.
"I guess that it's the captain, on t'other side. I wouldn't say for sure. I just know I'm asking the other side and it's the nicer folks. That's why I don't turn it the other way."
Spinning the star around, he traced his fingers cautiously along its lines.
"This way up, there isn't 1 point facing up. Then it's like the earth or the body or, like brute or animal forces gets the better of the spirit, and that's why that point's facing down. These 2 points, you see, they're horns."
For some reason, the way he said that final word sent a shiver down my spine.
"They're horns, stabbing up at heaven. This way up, you're not asking the nice folk. In fact, you're not asking folks at all. I'm not sure who or what you would be asking, but it doesn't matter because I won't be doing it. Ever. That sort of thing's more dangerous than you know. Sometimes they give the wrong answers. Sometimes they don't answer at all. Sometimes, though."
He leant in towards me, ensuring that no one else could overhear our conversation.
"Sometimes they don't take kindly to being disturbed. I mean, think about it all. All them magicians doing all their reading and stuff to conjure 'em, and then you just do it with a spinning top. It's disrespectful. It's also like they get sort of dragged here, if you know what I mean, from wherever they were before. If they don't want to come and you make 'em, well, let's just say I won't be doing it any time soon."
Unfortunately, as you may have guessed, not everyone had the same firm scruples as John Wiseman. Though it was many decades ago, I remember that night like it was yesterday. It had been a fairly quiet night. The patrons, including Wisey himself, had bid me good night and made their way home. All, that is, except for a fella called Arnie Pike. Arnie had only started drinking at the Anchor in the past few weeks. He always took up a stool at the bar with his back to the rest of the pub and stayed there the whole night. I'd got him talking a few times, but I hadn't honestly enjoyed the experience much, especially because, by the end of the night and kicking out time, Arnie was generally so well lubricated that he virtually slid off his bar stool and had to be helped to the door. I assumed on that night that the same thing was going to be true. After everyone else had left, Arnie remained, slumped literally over the bar and, by the looks of things, sound asleep. I decided that, as I had for the previous few nights, I'd leave him in situ whilst I collected the glasses, put up the chairs, and counted up the till. Then, when I was finally ready to leave, I'd toe-cap him out of the door, half carrying him until the taxi I'd ordered for him turned up to pick him up and take him home. Leaving Arnie sprawled over the bar like the drippings of a melted candle, I moved past him and pulled the big bolt to lock the pub's front door. I intended to tidy up on the other side of the pub with my back to Arnie, and, though our town is a fairly safe place, that would mean moving away from the till with the night's takings in it. I did not want to have to explain to Fred where they went if someone nipped in whilst my back was turned and made off with them, so better safe than sorry. It was hardly as if Arnie was going to be beating at the door to be let out. Having double-locked the door, I moved to the other end of the pub and proceeded to stack chairs and wipe down the tables. I'd been over on that side for about 15 minutes and was just about done when the lights went out. At first I wasn't worried. Power cuts were quite a regular thing back then, and often the lights came back on after a while. Unfortunately, this power cut had chosen to occur on a particularly dark, moonless night. As such, any light that might have come in through the windows was lessened, and the place was absolutely pitch black. For a moment, I stood in place, waiting in vain hope that the power would come back on. When it didn't after 2 minutes, I'll admit I started to feel a little worried. At first, only about practical things. How was I going to find my way across the room? How would I empty the till and cash up? And how the hell was I going to get the Sleeping Beauty out of his chair and out of the door when I literally couldn't see my hand in front of my face? What was more striking about the situation, however, was the sudden realization that I could not hear anything either. Now, I don't mean to suggest that I had gone deaf or that the darkness was actually me passing out. What I mean is that, all of a sudden, along with the disappearance of the light, the sound seemed to fade as well. Not so much switched off entirely, but muffled and shielded, like someone had thrown a thick blanket over the entire world. Sounds that had been there moments earlier seemed to have vanished, as if some prankster had secretly been around the building and installed super-thick triple glazing in all of the windows in the space of a couple of minutes. I reflected upon that for a moment. No, I thought, that's not quite right. For whilst the noises from outside, the hiss of the cars, the odd indistinct voices, the tugging yawl of the wind, had all been suddenly silenced, the effect was also felt within the room. It was as if that space, that room, for a short period of time, had been cut off from the rest of the world and set adrift. For a few moments, we were a place out of time, in our own private universe. We, I suddenly said aloud, the word catching and snagging as it passed through my thoughts. Arnie? I called across the room. Though I knew precisely how far away the bar was supposed to be, the lack of light seemed to create an odd effect, and suddenly I was calling out into an open void. Speaking into the blackness, the distances seemed to stretch out indeterminately forever, and Arnie seemed somehow to be very far away. Far enough, at least, that he could not hear me calling. I decided to try crossing the room. Even blind, I had a general idea of the topography of the place and knew that there was an unobstructed path to the bar if I just walked straight. Now, I know you will have read in many books and heard in many films the cliché that the minutes seemed to last for hours. We've all heard it, but only once in my life did I ever experience it in a literal sense. The important word in the phrase is seemed. It seemed to last for hours. In my case, it did not seem that way. It was that way. I walked in short, cautious steps, my hands groping blindly in front of me, expecting to hit the bar within perhaps a minute of setting off. Whilst it's possible that I was a little disoriented, I tried as best as I could to walk in a straight line, a roughly forward direction, straight towards the bar. It should have taken me no more than I'd say 20 or 30 cautious steps at most. Now imagine yourself in this scenario. You're in the dark, with no sound but your own laboured and increasingly panicked breathing, walking blindly towards something that you know is only a matter of steps away. How would you react if you found, to your utter disbelief, that a minute later you were still walking? That 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes later you were still proceeding ever forwards and hitting nothing. Your arms, which at first had been held before you carefully in case you ran into the edge of a table or a chair, now groped wildly about you, hoping to find an edge, a corner, a wall, as more and more panic within you built as you realized that you are alone in this never-ending nothing. Or perhaps not quite alone. As my hands flailed and swam in this sea of black, this impossibly large and endless space, I felt them, just for an instant, brush up against something. It was only for a second, and only with the very tips of my fingers, but from somewhere in that pit of nothing, my fingers fell on fur. I instantly pulled them back, snapping and recoiling my hand as if it had received an electric shock. I wanted to run, but to where? To scream, but who would hear? I opened my mouth to try anyway, but before the voice could escape, another, larger sound erupted from somewhere off to my left. It could not have been more than a few feet away, and yet it sounded as if it were at the farthest corner of a football field, and I was standing on the halfway line. It was the sound of a man screaming, bawling, and wailing in terror, or in pain. Above those awful cries, there were other voices. These voices were lower, both in a literal sense, in that the pitch was lower, but also in some other intangible way. They were voices that seemed below or beneath, as if they had slithered out from amongst the rocks, inches from the ground. They were voices that came from beneath, and they asked the same question over and over. Yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. Repeated over and over in a hideous, tormenting mantra. Yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. The other voice screamed, a tinny, high-pitched screech, and the lights came back on. Arnie was gone, and everything was smashed. The mirror behind the bar, the bottles, the glasses, the chairs were broken into splinters, tables upturned. It looked as if a tornado had been through the place. My jaw hung open in disbelief. I ran to the door, desperate to catch Arnie, to drag him back and make him explain what he'd done. It was only when I actually got to the door that I realized it was still locked, from the inside. It was the only entrance and the only exit. That meant Arnie had to still be there. But he wasn't. I ran back behind the bar and called the police. Whilst I tried to explain in a garbled way what had happened, sounding no doubt like I had drunk from every one of the bottles destroyed on the floor, I noticed that on the bar, precisely where Arnie had been sitting, was Wisey's box. It was open, and the waxed paper spread across the bar in front of where Arnie had been sitting. The spinning top was resting in the dead center of the star, and there were no coins placed on the horizontal points. Perhaps, I thought, he'd gotten it out to look at it. Maybe he wasn't attempting to play or to meddle with the game. Still, I could not help noticing that the single point was facing the stool on which he had been sitting. The other 2 points, the horns, were thrusting violently away from him. He had played the game the wrong way up. He had called, and someone, or something, had answered. After the police, I called Fred, sure that I'd be sacked and that he'd be furious. He actually arrived before the police. Walking in and surveying the damage, he said not a word. But he did walk over to where Arnie had been sitting. Quietly, he picked up the waxed paper, folded it, and placed it, carefully, back into the box, which he then put into its place on the shelf behind the bar. Fred told me that when the police arrived, I should say that I'd been in the cellar changing the pumps, that someone had broken in through a window and robbed the place whilst I was down there. I looked at him in disbelief. Walking past me and around the bar, he opened the till, took out the day's taking, and stuffed it into a small paper bag, which he then handed to me. Then, without saying another word, he walked back around the bar and out through the front door. Seconds later, I heard glass smashing as he threw a brick through one of the side windows and smashed the rest through with a nearby stick, spreading splintered shards all across the floor. Coming back into the pub, he surveyed the damage and his handiwork on the window. "There you go," he said, finally. "Not to worry, lad. You take that money. Consider it a bonus for your hard work.
It needs to go missing anyway, so that the insurance will cover all of this."
He waved at the mostly destroyed interior of the pub.
"It's not the first time. Probably won't be the last. People just don't learn."
I was gobsmacked, confused and panicked. I asked about Arnie. If it was him that screamed, then it was important we find him.
"Nobody's going to find him, lad. Not where he's gone."
Before I could ask what he meant by that, the police knocked at the door. When they asked what had happened, I told them what Fred had told me to say. I was down in the cellar. Nobody ever saw Arnie again. Around a year after the incident, a headstone was quietly added to the local cemetery with his name on it. Nobody knows if there is actually anyone in the plot below or who paid for the headstone, though I have always had my suspicions. In the weeks after the incident, the regulars helped get the place up and running again, from fixing tables and windows to restocking the spirits, much of which was paid for by Wisey himself, using funds from a big win he'd had the previous week. After that night with Arnie, I was never left to do a close on my own again. Of course, to the other customers this seemed logical. I had been robbed after all, but I knew damn well why Fred stayed on with me all those nights after. He guessed that I was scared. And he guessed right. What he perhaps didn't guess was the enormous guilt I felt about Arnie. I had lied to the police, and, though a missing persons report had been filed a few days later, by whom I don't know, not a hide nor hair was ever found of him, a fact that made me feel terrible. What if, I thought, my information could have helped them find him? What if something happened to him that night in the dark and I was the only witness? The guilt chewed at my insides, gnawing like a trapped rat. That was until one night about 9 months after it happened. Fred and I were closing up, but unusually for him, Wisey had chosen to stick around and was the last person remaining in the bar. I looked up from counting the till just in time to see Fred and him exchange a nod, after which Fred, without a word of explanation, put on his coat and headed for the door. Wisey approached the bar. He took the box from his pocket and placed it on the bar between us. He opened up the waxed paper as if ready to play the game. I was about to explain to him that I didn't have time to see him play and that I needed to get home, but before I could speak, he pressed a single finger to his lips to silence me.
"There are some things in this life, lad, that can't be summed up in a yes or no question. The answers are a bit more complicated than that. On the other hand, there are some things that are on a need-to-know basis, and if you don't need to know, well then, you probably never will."
For a moment I wondered where this was going, but then Wisey placed the spinning top in the center of the star, careful to ensure that the single point was directed away from him.
"Arnie," he said, shaking his head, "I know things about that man that you don't need to know. I fought alongside him during the war. I won't go into it, but watch."
He held up the spinning top and asked aloud,
"Was Arnie Pike a good man?"
He set the top spinning and nodded his head slowly when the end pointed firmly to no.
"You've nothing to feel guilty about, lad. He was always headed for the same place. It's his own stupid fault if he got there early."
I shrugged, trying to indicate that, whilst I appreciated what Wisey was trying to do for me, the guilt was unlikely to lift quite that easy. Folding the paper up and placing the coins and the top inside the box, he carefully closed the lid and handed it to me.
"Listen,"
he said firmly.
"When you're in a war and someone tells you that you can ask a yes or no question and always get the right answer, there's only one question that you ask every day. Will I make it to tomorrow? I've asked that same question of this game every day for decades. The answer was always the same, until this morning. So, I know what I'm going home to. Luckily, just like I knew about Arnie, I know where I'm headed as well. I'm happy with it. Looking forward to it, if I'm honest. If it's anything like it's cracked up to be, then there'll be a pint waiting for me when I get there. But it means I won't be here to play the game anymore. So, I'm passing it on to you. Take it and use it as you will." don't get greedy with it, and always make sure that you're careful about who you are asking."
I tried to refuse, but Wisey insisted.
"Ask about the fight tomorrow night. You can use the winnings to pay for my funeral."
I tried again to protest, to insist that he was talking nonsense, that there was no way he could know something like that for certain, but he just continued to smile.
"By the way,"
he said finally,
"if you do want to ask about Arnie, to put your mind at ease, then do it. Maybe you do need to know after all. Trust me, though, you've nowt to feel bad about. Take care, lad. I'll be seeing you, though, hopefully, not for a while."
With that, he got up from his stool and, whistling to himself like he didn't have a care in the world, headed for the door. Wisey, I perhaps do not need to tell you, died that night. I used the money from a bet placed the following day to pay for all of his funeral arrangements. A few weeks later, I finally gave in and played the game to ask about Arnie, about where he went, what happened to him, and finally whether he deserved what he got. The answers, though limited to yes and no, were completely in line with what Wisey had suggested. A few years later, believing that I was now on a need-to-know basis, I finally worked up the courage to ask Fred what he knew about Arnie. He told me and provided evidence to back up his claims. Knowing what I know now, I no longer feel guilty. I have been playing Wisey's game ever since, though I do it a little differently. Every Thursday after quiz night, I give every person in the pub a slip of paper to write a question on. Those questions go into a bag, and the lucky winner drawn at random gets their question answered. I never know what the question is, and neither does anyone else in the pub, but sometimes the answers mean an awful lot to the person who asks. Some have used it to make a lot of money, others to make big decisions in their lives. Still others predict the outcome of some very serious situations. I'm yet to hear of one occasion for which the game has been wrong. One question a week. It's a nice little tradition, and it keeps people coming to the Anchor at a time when people visit pubs less and less. It also reduces the chances of the game being misplayed. I am the only one who ever does the playing, and I am very careful about the direction of the points. I like to know beforehand exactly who I'm calling. This has been Wisey's Game, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2024 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.